Johann Sebastian Bach. In this session, we'll explore the life and work of the greatest composer of the Baroque period of music, and to many critics and fans, the greatest composer of all. His name was Johann Sebastian Bach, and he was one of the most prolific geniuses that ever lived, both in his professional and private life. He wrote over 1,000 musical pieces and still found time to father 20 children. And he did this while fulfilling very arduous duties as a musician, conductor, and teacher. Bach is widely accepted as the master of the Baroque style, a period of music that lasted from about 1600 to 1750, the year of his death. Baroque music is very complex and dramatic. It's characterized by its rich harmonies, its ornateness, and its broad theatrical concepts. By the time Bach was writing, Baroque had begun to fade in popularity and was considered old-fashioned in some circles. Yet he brought Baroque to its culmination, finishing off the era with the best music of the genre. He brought together all the basic forms and styles of the preceding generation, synthesized them, and perfected them. In doing so, he took certain elements of Baroque music to their greatest heights. This included the use of counterpoint, the playing of more than one melody at the same time, and the use of fugues, where different instruments repeat the same melody. Bach wrote both religious and secular music, and he wrote both instrumental and choral music. He worked in every musical form of the 18th century, with the exception of opera. In spite of his brilliant compositions, Bach was known in his own time more for his playing than his composing. He was a superb organist who dazzled people with his dexterity with the keyboard and foot pedals. He even occasionally used a stick in his mouth to reach particular notes. But spellbinding as his performances were, in the century that followed him, people began to recognize the magnificence of his compositions, and his reputation has grown steadily until he now ranks among the top 5 on almost any list of great composers. It would seem that such greatness was clearly his destiny from the beginning. Bach was born into a family that had for centuries produced musical virtuosos. In all, 76 of his male relatives were musicians. When Bach was 50 years old, he researched and wrote a genealogy on his unique family entitled Origin of the Musical Bach Family. In that work, he traced his ancestry back to a great-great-grandfather who was a baker and used to take a lute to the mill so he could play while he was grinding grain. Bach's amused comment on this was, "What a pretty noise they must have made together." However, he learnt to keep time, and this apparently was the beginning of music in our family. It was a family of which Bach and all the other Bachs was deeply proud. Bach himself was born March 21, 1685, in Eisenach, Germany. Throughout his life, he never traveled far from his hometown. He was trained as a boy by his father, Johann Ambrosia, who taught him to play the violin. His mother, Elizabeth, read to him from the Bible. Johann Sebastian Bach was a devout Lutheran, and religion played an important role throughout his life and in his music. By the time Bach was 9, both his parents had died, and he went to live with his brother, another Johann, this time a Johann Christoph. Untangling the Johanns in the Bach family tree is a challenging task that relies on the use of nicknames. There were 53 relatives named Johann, and Bach himself named 5 of his sons Johann, and 2 of his daughters Johanna. Bach's brother was an organist who had trained under the famous keyboard composer Johann Pachelbel. He gave Johann his first lessons on the instrument, as well as on the clavichord and the harpsichord. Johann stayed with him for 5 years, developing skills on the keyboard and studying composition on his own. He managed this simply by using the works of older composers as models. By the time he was only 15, Bach was able to support himself by singing and playing the organ in nearby towns he could walk to. Johann Bach is famous for his walking. He once walked 200 miles just to hear a favorite organist play, and he regularly walked to Hamburg and back, a distance of 50 kilometers each way. There's a story about how on his return from one of these journeys, exhausted and penniless, he stopped outside an inn to rest. Someone threw 2 herring heads onto the rubbish heap, and Bach picked them up to see if there was anything salvageable. Mysteriously, he found 1 coin in each head. Not only was he able to buy a solid meal, but he had enough money to make another more comfortable trek to Hamburg a short time later. In 1703, when he was 18, Bach took a post as violinist in the orchestra of the city of Weimar, which was ruled by the Duke of Saxe-Weimar. After 6 months, he was also appointed organist in nearby Arnstadt, a position that delighted him because Arnstadt had just recently built an exquisite new organ. It is here that he began to develop his flamboyant playing style. It is also here that he composed his earliest surviving works for the organ. Bach spent 2 years in Arnstadt, but the harmony in his music was not reflected in his personal life. He argued with the singers and musicians who found his work difficult and who didn't come up to his personal standards. He also argued with his employers constantly about the limited scope of his duties. They, in turn, were very annoyed when he took one of his famous walking trips to a city featuring a popular organist and didn't return for 2.5 months. It didn't help when Bach got into a public scuffle with a group of students who were seeking revenge for an insult he'd made to one of them. Bach had called the young man a nanny goat bassoonist because he'd made the bassoon sound like a goat. That evening, the student and 5 of his friends assaulted Bach, who pulled out a knife in self-defense. Although the fight was broken up before anyone was injured, the incident didn't do much for Bach's image or for the church, and eventually he was dismissed. These conflicts with authority would be a pattern in Bach's life. Almost every position he took resulted in personality clashes and fights with his superiors. He was one of the original difficult artists. In 1707, Bach married his first cousin, as was common in those days, and settled into a new position as organist in the city of Mühlhausen. His wife's name was Maria Barbara, and over the next 13 years, she would bear him 7 of his 20 children. One of the saddest moments of their lives was when their only twins died in infancy. Bach's second wife, Anna Magdalena, would bear the remaining 13. Bach's position in Mühlhausen got off to a bad start, not because of the authorities this time, but because of the public. The congregation in the church found his innovative music too difficult to understand, and he left in only a year. In that year, he brought compositions in to enlarge the choir library, tried to support more music in surrounding villages, and initiated a plan for rebuilding the organ. After he left, that building was completed, and he returned to help inaugurate it. After Mühlhausen, Bach returned to Weimar. He would remain in Weimar for 9 years, 9 very productive years, in which he wrote a series of cantatas, each to be performed on sequential Sundays. Bach worked in the court of the Duke of Saxe-Weimar during this time as court organist and chamber musician. Part of his duties were also to compose music for religious services, and so it was during this time that he wrote many of his cantatas and some of his finest organ pieces. Bach's music underwent a profound change during this period. He was influenced by Italian opera and by Italian concerto composers such as Antonio Vivaldi, and his musical techniques began to reflect this influence. Always short-tempered, Bach became angry in Weimar when he was passed up for a promotion to music director. He looked for another position, found one with Prince Leopold of Cothen, and asked to be relieved from his duties at Weimar. This led to an argument that so unnerved the Duke that he slapped Bach into prison for a month. The argument may have been provoked by the fact that the Duke was an enemy of Leopold's 2 nephews. Whatever provoked it, Bach's time in jail was not wasted. He wrote 46 pieces of music, some with his children in mind. When he was released, Bach moved to the city of Cothen, where he served as director of music for Prince Leopold. He remained there for 6 years until 1723. Bach was required to write chiefly chamber and orchestral music, but the religious services at Leopold's court were simple and required little imagination. Instead, Bach devoted himself to composing non-religious instrumental music. During this time, his first wife, Maria Barbara, died unexpectedly, possibly of a heart attack. Bach suffered a severe depression for the first few months, but a year and a half later, he married his second wife, Anna Magdalena, daughter of a trumpeter and a singer and keyboard player herself. Anna Magdalena was a younger woman, joyful and energetic, and quite willing to take over the responsibility of raising Bach's children. He was so delighted with her that he wrote her a special poem for their wedding day that read, Your servant, sweetest Madam Bride, joy be with you this morning. To see you in your flowery crown and wedding day adorning would fill with joy the sternest soul. What wonder as I meet you that my fond heart and loving lips o'erflow with song to greet you. Anna Magdalena would become a valuable partner in Bach's work and helped so much with the copying of his compositions that eventually her handwriting was identical to his. She would also give him 13 more children. Anna always believed that her husband's work was sacred, and once said that she had come closer to God through his music than through all the sermons she'd heard in her lifetime. Bach was a devoted father, in spite of the immense amounts of time his work and composing required. He taught all his children music and wrote special compositions to help them exercise each finger and train their hands. Evenings at the Bach house were often lively musical affairs where everyone gathered together to play instruments and sing. Visitors reported that Bach almost always had one or two of the youngest children propped upon his lap. Although only 10 of the 20 Bach children lived to adulthood, 4 of them became famous composers in their own right. There were Wilhelm Friedmann, Carl Philipp Emanuel, Johann Christoph, and Johann Christian, the latter of whom became a good friend of Mozart's and is known today as the English Bach. Those who knew Bach say he was a congenial and modest man, in spite of the stubbornness and temper that seemed to plague his employers. He dressed in somber black clothes and wore a heavy gray wig in the typical elaborate style of the times, a wig that made his already large head seem even larger. His eyes were intense and narrow, probably from many years of poring over manuscripts. He was slightly rotund, not surprising since he had a great passion for food and beer. His greatest passion, however, was coffee, and he even wrote a cantata to it once, partially to tease his daughter Lieschen, who had reprimanded him for the large amounts he consumed. The cantata tells the story of a father Schlendrian, whose daughter Lieschen has a passion for coffee. The father tries to cure the daughter of her weakness, but she's finally victorious when she declares that she will never marry unless, in the words Bach wrote, her lover will promise to her in person and insert it in the marriage settlements that she will be allowed to make coffee as she pleases. The coffee cantata became famous throughout the country. Bach's other favorite pastime was smoking his pipe, and he composed a song about that too, a song that delighted his wife and which she often sung to him. It went, "Whenever in an hour of leisure with Naster good my pipe I fill, and sit and smoke for rest or pleasure, sad pictures rise without my will. Watching the clouds of smoke float by, I think, how like this pipe am I." Bach's life in Cothen was happy, and he appreciated the prince, who was genuinely interested in and informed about music. But all that changed in 1721, when Leopold took a wife. She was a demanding spouse, someone Bach called an amusa, or opponent to the muses. She was bored with music and took no interest in a special ode Bach had set to music for her wedding day. The prince soon had little time for music or for his friend Bach, and Bach felt neglected. When he found himself playing less and less an important role at court, he once again set out to find a new position elsewhere. This time he found one in Leipzig, where he was appointed choir leader and music director at St. Thomas School, which provided the music and singers for the churches in the area. It was a very prestigious post that put Bach basically in charge of the music for the entire city. In Leipzig, Bach produced a large number of cantatas, sometimes at the rate of one a week. As a devout Lutheran, Bach's work often reflected a strongly